I think it began on the morning when the devotion I had carried so gently for so many years finally settled its full weight inside my chest, not as the warm solace I once believed it to be, but as something denser, heavier, something that pressed against the fragile lattice of my ribs as though it wished to reshape the very architecture of who I was. And in that first quiet moment before the city's mechanical dawn shuddered through the hive walls, I felt a tremor in my breath, a soft, inward tightening, like a hand curling in slow patience around my heart. And I realized with a clarity that stung like cold metal against bare skin that faith had ceased to be a comfort and had instead become something that demanded more of me than I had ever been prepared to give. I sat at the foot of my narrow cot, my palms resting against my thighs, and for a long moment I simply breathed in the dim glow of the flickering lumen strip above my head, the air thick with incense residue from last night's vigil, and I felt my devotion stir beneath my sternum with a strange, pulsing ache that radiated through my bones in soft waves. And in that trembling stillness, my whispered confession rose through my mind before I could stop it. If you wish to understand what it truly means, stay with me until the end, because I already knew that something inside me had begun its slow unraveling, and I needed someone, anyone, to witness the quiet tragedy that was only just beginning. The cogitator chime for morning prayer had not yet sounded, but still I rose, guided by the familiar tug of obligation woven into the rhythm of my breath. And as I dressed, each buckle of my uniform tightened further than the last, the straps pressing into my skin with a faint sting that once would have felt like discipline, but now felt like devotion testing the softness of my flesh to see how much more it could claim. Stepping into the corridor, I felt the hive awaken around me, the distant thunder of manufactoria machinery rumbling through the walls, the sighing groan of ancient ventilation ducts exhaling warm, metallic breath along the spine of the passage, and the faint resonance of distant chanting drifting upward from the lower cathedral, each voice blending into a single, low lamentation that wrapped around my ears like cloth soaked in sorrow. And I moved through that trembling symphony with the same careful reverence I had carried since childhood, though now each sound seemed to press against me, urging me deeper, heavier, closer to something vast and unseen. As I descended the narrow stairwell toward the shrine where I had served for 20 years, my knees pulsed with a faint ache, a soreness I had once attributed to long hours of kneeling on metal floors. But today the ache throbbed deeper, as though something beneath the bones strained gently outward, a quiet reminder that devotion carves its own paths through the body in ways no prayer ever warns you about. I paused on the final step before the shrine's entrance, my hand resting against the cold archway carved with sigils of duty and sacrifice. And for a brief moment I closed my eyes, inhaling the scent of old incense, burnt oil, and the faint tang of candle smoke. And in the silence that settled inside me, I felt something shift, soft, subtle, like the slow tightening of a thread drawn through flesh. And when I exhaled, my breath came out thinner, as though devotion had taken a small portion of it for itself. Stepping inside, I found the shrine empty, the lumen globes casting long, trembling shadows across the floor where a scattering of dried flower petals lay curled and brittle from last night's vigil. And as I approached the central altar, the flickering votive candles guttered suddenly, their flames bending toward me as if drawn by my presence, as though recognizing something in me that had changed during the night, something that now resonated with the dim, quivering light. Kneeling before the altar, I lowered my forehead to the cold metal rail, and the moment my skin touched it, a tremor rippled through my skull, a soft, internal vibration that hummed behind my eyes like the faint echo of a whispered prayer spoken not by me but through me. And I felt a warmth seep downward from the base of my skull, flowing along my spine with the slow, deliberate certainty of consecrated oil poured over flesh during anointment. Except there was no oil, no priest, no ritual, only the quiet, undeniable truth that devotion itself had reached toward me. My fingers curled against the floor, nails scraping lightly against the metal as another tremor pulsed outward from my chest, this one sharper, as though something within my sternum had tightened its grip, and I felt the edges of my ribs press inward with a soft ache that bordered on pleasure, the kind of ache that comes from willingly leaning into pain because one believes it holy, believes it necessary, believes it deserved. And even as the pressure grew, I did not pull away. For I had spent my entire life believing that suffering was simply the shape devotion carved into the faithful. And yet, as the pressure deepened, spreading through my shoulders, down my arms, settling into the hollow of my abdomen, I realized with a slow, rising dread that devotion was no longer shaping me metaphorically. It was shaping me physically, its unseen fingers threading through muscle and bone with quiet patience. When I finally lifted my head from the altar, the candles' flames bent inward again, their trembling light wrapping around me like a fragile embrace, and in the wavering glow I saw my reflection in the polished surface of a devotional plaque, a face I recognized but no longer fully owned, eyes ringed with a faint sheen of moisture not born of tears, but of something flickering behind them, something watching from deep within the shadows of my mind with a softness that felt almost affectionate. I rose unsteadily to my feet, the weight in my chest shifting as though adjusting itself to my movement, and when I turned toward the doorway, the shrine seemed to exhale, a warm, heavy breath that brushed against my spine with the intimacy of a hand placed gently between the shoulder blades, guiding me forward, reminding me that devotion had begun to settle into my flesh with the same patient certainty as a seed rooting itself into yielding soil. And as I stepped back into the corridor, the prayer chime finally sounding in the distance with a hollow, echoing toll that vibrated faintly through my bones, I knew with a quiet, trembling certainty that I had taken the first step into a transformation I could no longer resist, a transformation in which devotion would not merely guide my actions or steady my heart, but tighten itself around my flesh, bone, and breath until there was no part of me that remained untouched by its quiet, inexorable claim. From the moment the prayer chime's hollow toll seeped through the corridor walls and settled into the marrow of my bones, I felt a heaviness blooming inside my chest that made each breath drag slower than the last, as though the very air had thickened in response to my earlier confession at the altar. And as I walked toward the lower sanctum where morning devotions were held, the corridor around me seemed to constrict, not physically, but spiritually, its familiar arches, pipes, and trembling lumen strips bending inward with a subtle tightening, the way lungs constrict when panic draws its first quiet knot beneath the ribs. My boots echoed softly against the metal floor, each step falling in perfect time with the low vibrations humming beneath the hive's skin. And with every footfall, I felt the weight inside me shift, pressing more insistently against bone, as if devotion itself had begun to swell within my chest, too large to remain contained, yet too patient to fully break through. And the sensation left me trembling with a kind of reverent dread that clung to the edges of my thoughts like smoke curling around a dying flame. When I reached the sanctum entrance, a thin trail of incense drifted out through the half-open door, its scent richer and more metallic than usual, carrying with it an undertone that tasted faintly of dust and rusted prayer bells. And as I stepped through the threshold, the air grew warmer, thicker, filling my lungs with a density that felt almost liquid, like warm oil sliding slowly into my breaths, coating the insides of my throat until the words of the ritual began to fragment in my mind before I could voice them. The sanctum was nearly empty. Only a few devotees knelt before the towering icon of the Emperor's radiant form, their silhouettes trembling in the flickering half-light cast by lumen torches that sputtered with exhausted devotion. But even their bowed heads did nothing to dispel the heavy silence pressing into the chamber, a silence that felt not peaceful but watchful, as though the walls were waiting for something to break. I took my place near the back, lowering myself to my knees with the slow, careful reverence that had been drilled into me since childhood. Yet the moment my palms touched the cold metal floor, I felt a pulse beneath my hands, faint but distinct, like a heartbeat echoing from deep within the sanctum's foundation. And the tremor traveled up my arms in a warm shiver that settled beneath my collarbones with an intimacy that left my breath unsteady. Closing my eyes, I tried to summon the prayer that had always come so easily. O Emperor, guide my steps, anchor my soul. But the words faltered, catching in my throat as though resisted from within, and my breath thinned into a shallow tremor as the warmth in my chest tightened again, circling inward with a slow constriction that made me feel as though an unseen hand were wrapping its fingers gently but firmly around my ribs. The lead cantor's voice rose at the front of the sanctum, but instead of its usual strength, today it wavered, cracked slightly, as if he too struggled beneath the heavy air, and the communal prayer that should have followed came out fragmented, the voices of the few devotees breaking apart like brittle threads pulled too tight, each attempt at harmony faltering under the oppressive silence that fed on their sincerity. When I opened my eyes again, the icon seemed larger than it had moments before, its once bright surface dimmed by layers of soot and candle smoke. Yet the eyes, those cold, carved orbs meant to symbolize divine vigilance, shimmered faintly with reflected flame, giving the impression of movement, of watching, of expectation. And beneath that unblinking gaze, the warmth inside my chest pulsed again, stronger now, spreading outward in slow, deliberate tendrils that seeped along my ribs, threading through the spaces between bone like living cords, tightening around a frame that had grown too fragile to support itself. I bowed my head, not out of ritual but necessity, because lifting it suddenly felt too heavy. And as my forehead hovered inches above the metal floor, I felt the air shift. A soft, nearly inaudible exhale passing through the chamber, brushing the back of my neck with a chill that contradicted the heat pulsing from within me. And though no one else reacted, I felt it as distinctly as if someone had leaned close enough to whisper into my ear. The sensation triggered something deep behind my sternum, and the warmth there tightened sharply, contracting with a pressure that forced a thin gasp from my lips. And for a moment I thought I might collapse entirely. Yet the pressure softened as quickly as it had surged, spreading instead into a slow, burning throb that made my vision dim around the edges even though my eyes were open. The cantor's voice drifted into silence, replaced by the sputtering crackle of the lumen torches as they struggled to maintain their failing light. And in that dimming glow, the sanctum felt less like a place of worship and more like a chamber of quiet suffocation, a place where prayers were offered not upward but inward, sinking into the flesh of those who dared to kneel too deeply. I tried to rise, to shift the weight pressing down on my shoulders, but the moment I pushed against the floor, my arms trembled violently, and the warmth inside my chest surged upward, brushing the hollow of my throat with a soft, pulsing ache that felt disturbingly like a voice forming from within, testing the shape of my breath as though preparing to speak through me. Dread coiled inside my stomach, cold and tight, but beneath it was something else, a strange, fragile comfort, the kind that comes from the touch of someone who has long observed your suffering and now reaches to ease it, regardless of whether their hand brings relief or destruction. And I realized with a painful, quiet clarity that devotion had begun to rewrite me not as a worshiper, but as a vessel, reshaping my breath, my posture, the cadence of my heartbeat, until my very being hummed with an obedience too deep for words. When I finally managed to stand, the air pressed close around me, as though reluctant to release me from the sanctum's grasp. And as I walked back toward the threshold, each step echoing softly in the hollow silence, I felt the warmth inside me settle once more, no longer tightening, no longer pulsing, but resting with the patient certainty of something that had not been denied, only delayed. And as I stepped into the corridor, the last flicker of light from the sanctum brushed my back with a fading glow that felt uncomfortably like a hand withdrawing, leaving me with the suffocating truth that my unanswered prayers had begun to coil inward, filling the space faith once occupied with a quiet hunger that would not remain patient for long. From the moment I stepped away from the sanctum's dim light and into the trembling quiet of the corridor beyond, I felt the weight inside my chest shift again, not as a tightening this time, but as a subtle downward pull, a gathering of warmth in the hollow of my abdomen that radiated outward in slow, deliberate waves, as though devotion had uncoiled itself slightly to test the boundaries of my flesh, testing how deeply it could settle before I resisted. And when I did not resist, when I merely breathed through the soft ache blooming beneath my ribs, the warmth seeped deeper, pushing downward like a hand pressing gently but firmly against pliant muscle, urging it to yield, to bend, to reshape itself according to a purpose older and heavier than my own fragile will. The corridor around me hummed faintly, the lumen strips overhead flickering in asynchronous pulses, their trembling glow reflecting off the rusted walls with an almost organic shudder, as though the hive itself strained to stay awake beneath the weight of unspoken prayers. And as I walked, the soft throb of devotion within me began to sync with the flickering lights, each pulse of warmth rising in perfect rhythm with each dim glow, creating a strange illusion that the air itself breathed in time with my body. Inhaling when I inhaled, exhaling when I exhaled, watching me with the attentiveness of a creature, assessing the slow emergence of something it had planted. I tried to focus on the route toward the reliquary where my duties would lead me next, but my steps felt different, heavier, slower, as though the weight in my limbs no longer belonged fully to me. And with each movement, the warmth inside my abdomen spread upward and outward, sliding along the underside of my ribs in a way that felt both intimate and intrusive, a soft pressure that seemed to trace the outline of each bone, as if learning the cage that housed it, memorizing my structure so it might settle more perfectly inside me. A faint dizziness washed over me, warm and indulgent, blurring the edges of the corridor into streaks of trembling light, and I placed a hand against the wall to steady myself, expecting cold metal, but instead the surface carried a faint warmth that pulsed beneath my palm, responding to my touch with a subtle shiver, and the sensation traveled slowly up my arm, settling into my shoulder with a gentle pressure that made the ache inside my chest flare in quiet recognition. As though the wall itself acknowledged the presence growing within me, I withdrew my hand sharply, but the warmth beneath my skin remained, pooling in my fingertips, threading into the bones of my hand with a slow, creeping familiarity. And as I continued down the corridor, the sensation deepened, spreading through my arms, weaving into muscle and sinew with the patient resolve of something that knew I could not resist it. By the time I reached the reliquary's entrance, the ache inside my abdomen had grown into a steady hum that vibrated faintly through my sternum, echoing through my spine in a quiet rhythm that made it difficult to tell where my body ended and where devotion began. And when I pushed open the heavy door, its hinges groaned in a deep, resonant tone that seemed to vibrate directly against the warmth inside me, as though the reliquary itself recognized the change, acknowledging the subtle shift in my flesh with a low, welcoming sigh. The chamber was dim, its only light emanating from the sacred lamps that burned slow and thick with oil distilled from ancient rites, their flames casting long, trembling shadows across rows of sealed reliquary boxes resting on towering shelves that reached toward the high, vaulted ceiling. And as the door closed behind me, sealing out the faint, ambient hum of the corridor, the silence inside the chamber pressed against my ears with a weight that felt almost physical, as though the air had thickened to accommodate the presence stirring within my body. I approached the central altar, my steps echoing softly in the cavernous space, and with each footfall the warmth inside me swelled, rising through my torso in slow, upward spirals that pressed against the underside of my sternum, then against the hollow of my throat, and for a moment I felt a soft pressure bloom beneath my jaw, a gentle upward push that guided my chin slightly higher than I intended, as if devotion wished to adjust my posture itself, shaping the way I presented myself before sacred ground. The realization sent a thin tremor of fear through me, a cold thread of clarity that pulsed briefly through the thick warmth suffusing my body. But the fear vanished just as quickly, drowned beneath another slow wave of heat that melted through my bones with the tender weight of a hand smoothing over trembling skin. And I exhaled in a long, shuddering breath that tasted faintly of incense and iron, as though the very air of the reliquary seeped into my lungs and settled there, heavy and patient. Kneeling before the altar, I reached for the ritual cloth, but my hand faltered midway, my fingers curling involuntarily as the warmth inside my arm tightened slightly, guiding the motion rather than allowing it. And for a moment, I simply watched my own hand hover there, suspended by something deeper than muscle, deeper than intent. As though my body had become a vessel for a gesture I did not fully command. With slow inevitability, my hand lowered itself, my fingers brushing the cloth with a gentleness I had not consciously chosen. And as they curled around the fabric, devotion tightened around my wrist, not painfully, not harshly, but with the firm softness of a parent guiding a child's grasp, encouraging obedience through the quiet promise of relief. And the moment I accepted that guidance, the warmth within me flowed upward in a gentle rush, flooding my chest with a soft, aching pleasure that made my eyes sting with a sudden, unbidden tear. I bowed my head over the altar, letting the cloth drape across my hands, and as I did, the warmth inside me pressed outward against my ribs with a slow, pulsing insistence, as though testing the boundaries of its cage, reshaping the space within me with quiet determination until my breath no longer felt like my own but like a shared exhale, my lungs expanding, but devotion breathing through them. When I finally lifted my head again, the chamber seemed brighter, though the flames had not grown, and the shadows on the walls trembled in long, rippling lines that appeared to lean closer, as if the reliquary itself had recognized the shift occurring within my flesh, acknowledging that devotion had begun to shape me not as a servant, but as a vessel, a body meant to obey the quiet while settling beneath my bones. Rising to my feet with slow, trembling care, I felt the warmth settle deeper into me, no longer shifting, no longer testing, but resting with the quiet certainty of something claiming its rightful place. And as I left the reliquary, the ache in my chest softened into a steady, patient throb, the heartbeat of devotion itself, echoing inside me with a rhythm I knew would only grow stronger with each passing breath. From the moment I stepped out of the reliquary and the door closed behind me with a soft metallic sigh, I felt the warmth inside my chest shift again. Not outward this time, not upward or downward, but inward, folding itself deeper into the hollow beneath my sternum with a tenderness so unsettling it made my breath catch halfway up my throat. And in that suspended moment, my own heartbeat seemed to falter, stutter, then resume with a new cadence, slower and heavier, as though an unseen presence had pressed its palm against the rhythm of my pulse and adjusted it with quiet authority. The corridor ahead shimmered faintly, the lumen strips along the ceiling trembling in uneven pulses that matched the slow throb inside my ribs. And for the first time since this transformation began, I sensed the air around me subtly bending, not rushing, not stirring, but yielding, as though the very atmosphere recognized the presence that now nestled inside my body, offering space, offering silence, offering reverence. And the sensation made my bones ache with the quiet gravity of something wholly settling into place. I walked slowly, each step measured and deliberate, because the warmth inside me had begun to respond to movement in strange, intimate ways, spreading upward in soft spirals whenever I inhaled too sharply, settling low and heavy whenever my breath grew quick. And the more I noticed its responses, the more aware I became of the fact that I was no longer breathing alone. There was a second breath beneath mine, subtle at first, almost imperceptible. like the faint exhale of an unseen presence hovering just behind my heartbeat. And though I tried to dismiss it as imagination, the sound grew clearer with every footfall, every tremor of my bones, until it formed a steady rhythm that tangled itself through my lungs with a familiarity that did not belong to me. When I reached a narrow archway that led toward the old cloister halls, the sensation deepened, expanding across my shoulders like a warm hand resting on either side of my spine, guiding me gently forward, and the air that filled my lungs tasted different, richer, heavier, carrying a faint tint of incense so old it seemed woven into the stones themselves. And beneath that scent was something warmer, softer, something that tasted like the breath of another person, pressed close against my mouth during a whispered confession. The halls were empty, silent except for the low hum of distant machinery vibrating through the floor. Yet as I walked, I heard the faint rustle of robes brushing stone, footsteps that did not belong to me, breaths that did not match the rise and fall of my chest, and I felt the hairs along my arms rise as the warmth inside me expanded with sudden alertness, as though recognizing a presence long before my senses could confirm it. With each step, the second breath grew louder, clearer, until it no longer echoed faintly in my lungs but moved in perfect synchrony with my inhale and exhale, an intimate cadence that pressed against the back of my throat with the softness of warm fog. And I found myself slowing, trembling, because the sensation was no longer simply warmth or pressure or ache. It was presence, unmistakably, undeniably presence, the quiet, patient breath of something vast and ancient settling into the fragile architecture of my body, with the reverence of a deity entering a temple. I pressed a hand against the wall to steady myself, and the moment my palm met cold stone, the second breath deepened, resonating through my bones with a low, unmistakable hum that was not vibration, not sound, but something felt beneath the skin, something that pulsed through my marrow like a whispered command, not spoken in words but in breath, in warmth, in the slow tightening of devotion's grip around my ribs. As I stood there, trembling with my forehead pressed lightly against the wall, the hum gathered in strength, swelling into a soft, rhythmic pressure beneath my sternum. And for one impossible moment, the breath inside me shifted, not aligned with my own, but layered beneath it. A deeper inhale, a slower exhale, as though a second set of lungs had begun to expand and contract beneath my own flesh. And the sensation pulled a quiet gasp from my lips, my breath stuttering as the warmth inside me surged upward to cradle the back of my skull with a gentle, suffocating ache. I closed my eyes, trying to steady myself, but the moment darkness washed over my vision, I felt the breath, not mine, not fully mine, pressed through me with a slow, deliberate exhale that slid up the back of my throat and spilled past my lips in a whisper so soft it barely disturbed the air. And though no voice formed, no words emerged, the intent carried within that exhale was unmistakable. I am here. Breathe for me. My knees weakened at the weight of that silent command, and I slid down the wall until I was kneeling, my hands trembling against the floor as the warmth inside my chest spread outward in gentle waves, each one timed perfectly with the second breath that continued to move within me, guiding my inhale, shaping my exhale, molding my breath into a cadence that felt older than my body, older than the hive, older than faith itself. I wanted to resist, to reclaim my breath as mine alone, but the warmth that pressed against my lungs was tender, patient, almost loving, and with each passing moment the resistance drained from my limbs, replaced with a quiet, heavy calm that settled into my bones like oil poured over aching joints, soothing, smoothing, softening all the places where fear had once lived. As the warmth crept up my spine and circled the base of my skull like a soft, tightening coil, I felt the second breath deepen again, and this time the exhale that moved through me carried a low, vibrating hum that resonated behind my eyes, filling the hollow space of my mind with a glow that felt like distant sunlight filtered through stained glass, dim but warm, ancient and patient, and the sensation drew tears from me, silent tears that rolled down my cheeks and dripped onto my hands as the hum settled deeper, becoming a steady presence that did not ask but was, shaping my breath, guiding my posture, claiming my voice before it ever needed to speak. When I finally opened my eyes again, the corridor seemed to waver slightly, the air trembling with the echo of that warm hum. And though I felt smaller, more fragile, I also felt held, supported by something that had wrapped itself around my lungs, my breath, my very ability to exist, until devotion was no longer something I offered outward, but something that breathed inward through me, quietly, steadily, patiently, as if waiting for the moment when it would not just inhabit my flesh, but become it. And as I pressed a trembling hand to my chest, feeling the slow, heavy pulse of that second breath rising and falling beneath my skin, I realized with a shivering certainty that I had not merely heard the Emperor's breath. I had become part of it, and it had only just begun to reshape me from within. From the moment I rose unsteadily from the cloister floor, the lingering warmth coiled beneath my ribs like a second heartbeat. I felt the heaviness inside me shift with a new and unsettling clarity, as though the breath that had settled into my lungs now reached deeper, exploring the hidden chambers of my body with the slow, deliberate patience of a presence learning the geography of its new home. And as I stepped back into the corridor, my bones ached, not with the dull soreness of strain, but with a sharper, more intimate throb, like memory itself had begun to carve its shape into the marrow, etching devotion into the deepest part of me where no prayer had ever reached. The air around me felt thicker than before, warm and close, its density pressing against my skin as though the very atmosphere recognized the shift within me. And the lumen strips overhead flickered in slow, rhythmic pulses that matched the breath moving through my lungs, creating an eerie harmony between the trembling light and the quiet cadence of the presence breathing inside me. With each step, the ache in my bones deepened, blooming outward from my spine in a slow, radiating wave that wrapped around my ribs with the tenderness of an embrace and the inevitability of a shackle. And though fear fluttered at the edges of my mind, it was smothered beneath the heavier sensation of calm that pressed gently against the back of my skull, soft and warm and impossibly patient, urging me onward as though guiding a wounded pilgrim toward an altar they could no longer resist. I walked as if in a trance, each movement guided not by thought but by the slow adjustment of warmth beneath my sternum. And when my path led me toward the catacomb stairs, those narrow, winding steps descending beneath the shrine complex into the vault where the bones of long-forgotten servants of the Emperor were stored, I did not question why my feet carried me there, for the warmth within me pulsed with quiet approval, tightening faintly around my ribs as though encouraging the descent. The stairwell air was colder, laced with the dryness of old stone and ancient dust, but as I moved deeper, the breath inside me grew warmer, pressing against my spine in soft, rhythmic pulses that countered the chill and sent a delicate shiver down the length of my back. And the deeper I descended, the more I felt my bones resonate with a strange, fragile ache, as if recognizing the presence of those who had been shaped by devotion long before me. When I reached the bottom of the stairs, the catacomb corridor stretched before me in an endless procession of shadows and quiet alcoves where ossuaries lay stacked in precise, reverent rows, each box carved with names worn so thin by time that they resembled faded scars carved into old skin. And as I stepped into that quiet hall, the breath within my chest deepened again, its exhale brushing against the walls of my lungs in a soft, almost mournful sigh that echoed faintly through the catacomb like a grieving memory carried on warm air. I moved forward, each footfall sending a faint tremor through my bones, and with every step the ache grew sharper, more insistent, as though the presence within me wished to remind my body of all it had carried, of every moment of kneeling, of every hour bent in service, of every fragment of self offered to the altar with trembling hands. And the deeper the ache pressed, the more I realized I could no longer distinguish where my own memories ended and where devotion's weight began. Passing the first row of ossuaries, I paused, drawn to a box whose carved name was nearly worn away, and when I brushed my fingertips gently across its surface, a sharp ache flared through my wrist and up into my elbow. Not pain inflicted by touch, but pain released by memory. A sudden, heavy grief that did not belong to me but still hollowed my breath as though it had been waiting for this moment to surface. The warmth inside my chest pulsed in response, spreading through my arm in a soothing wave that softened the ache even as it deepened the heavy silence around me. And for one breathless moment, I felt the strange, impossible sensation of another pulse threading through my bones, a quiet rhythm that was not my own but resonated within me with the familiarity of a story told long before I was born. I stumbled back, breath trembling, and the warmth tightened around my ribs as though steadying me, holding me upright, guiding me deeper into the catacomb where the air grew warmer despite the cold stone, warmer in a way that felt almost alive, as though breath from the countless dead seeped through the cracks between their bones, rising to greet the presence waking within mine. Further down the hall, the floor dipped slightly, and as I stepped into that lowered space, the ache in my bones sharpened again, this time spreading from my spine into the long bones of my legs, threading through my thighs in slow, pulsing waves that made my muscles tremble beneath my weight. And the sensation grew so strange, so intimate, that for a moment I felt as though my body were being gently stretched from within, reshaped by patient hands smoothing their way along the contours of my frame, coaxing the bone to bend, to remember, to yield. I pressed a trembling hand to my sternum, expecting to feel the erratic thrum of fear beneath my skin. But instead I felt only the slow, steady pulse of the presence breathing through me. A pulse so calm, so certain, so impossibly steady that it drowned out my own trembling, replacing my fear with a heavy, aching tenderness that made my eyes burn with unspilled tears. The catacomb air grew warmer still, carrying with it a faint scent of old incense and dried marrow, and as I approached the central chamber where the oldest bones were kept, those whose names had been carried into obscurity centuries ago, the warmth within me surged upward, pressing against the back of my throat with a soft, suffocating ache that made my breath catch, and for a moment I felt my knees buckle beneath me. The bones in my legs trembling, as though struggling to hold the weight of devotion settling deeper into their hollow centers. I sank to my knees, hands resting on the cold stone floor, and the moment my palms met the ground, a faint vibration rippled through the floor and up into my arms, a hum so gentle, so low, that it felt less like sound and more like the distant echo of a heartbeat pressed against the earth, and the warmth inside me responded with a deep, slow exhale that moved through my body with the same soft inevitability as a tide returning to shore. As I knelt there, trembling in the heavy stillness, the ache in my bones settled into a steady, rhythmic throb that felt eerily like memory. Not mine, but memory carried through flesh, through marrow, through devotion's slow and patient carving. And I understood with a quiet, sorrowful clarity that my bones were no longer simply the framework of my body. They had become a record, a script etched by devotion's hand, a cage sculpted without cruelty yet without mercy, a vessel made to hold the weight of breath that no longer belonged solely to me. And as I lifted my head in the dim, flickering light of the catacomb, the warmth inside me tightened once more, curling around my ribs with a gentle, possessive ache. And in that intimate tightening, I understood that devotion had begun to claim me not as a servant or a believer, but as a home, and my bones remembered every part of what it had already taken. From the moment I pulled myself upright from the cold catacomb floor, the warmth inside my chest settling with a slow, heavy certainty that felt like a hand resting possessively beneath my ribs, I realized that something fundamental within me had begun to dissolve, not violently, not abruptly, but with the same patient inevitability as candle wax softening beneath a long burning flame. And the memories that had once anchored me to myself wavered like fragile silhouettes trembling at the edge of an encroaching light, their shapes thinning, blurring, as though devotion's breath exhaled gently against the fragile surfaces of my identity. I stepped away from the ossuary alcove, my legs trembling under the faint, rhythmic ache blooming along the length of my bones. And as I moved through the dim corridor, the lumen strips flickered in languid, uneven pulses, their wavering glow stretching my shadow across the stone floor in elongated, unraveling shapes that distorted with each step. And watching those trembling forms made something deep inside me tight. The faint, instinctual fear that I too was beginning to stretch thin, pulled gently apart by the warmth threading through my spine. The air in the catacomb thickened as I walked, heavy with the scent of dust and the faint, lingering sweetness of ancient incense absorbed by the stones across centuries. And each breath I drew carried not the clarity of air but the softness of memory dissolving into warm fog. And with every inhale, I felt the presence inside me exhale in return, its slow breath curling through my lungs like warm smoke, filling the spaces where my own thoughts had once lived with quiet, patient certainty. I tried to recall the name of my childhood district, the place where I had first learned to kneel before an altar, hands trembling with the earnest devotion of someone who believed their prayers could shape the world. But the memory slipped through my grasp like water through cupped hands, dissolving before I could grasp even its simplest contours. And in its stead rose a soft throb beneath my sternum, a warmth that whispered without words. You no longer need that name. You no longer need that beginning. You belong to something more enduring now. I reached the stairwell leading back toward the shrine complex, and as I ascended, my breath echoed strangely inside me, not only as sound, but as sensation, each inhale accompanied by the faint brush of another breath layered beneath my own, and each exhale thinning as though only a portion of it belonged to me, the rest claimed by the warmth that pulsed gently through my body. The higher I climbed, the more the ache in my bones softened, melting into a warmth so soothing it felt almost narcotic, and the dissolution of my thoughts grew easier, less frightening, as though the presence inside me wrapped warm hands around my mind and guided each fading memory into quiet darkness with reverent care. By the time I reached the upper corridor, the low hum of the hive resonated through the walls with a deeper, almost melodic cadence, and the sound vibrated through my ribs with such intimacy that it felt as if the hive itself breathed through me, its ancient, weary lungs syncing their rhythm with the slow, deliberate inhale of the devotion coiled within me. I walked through familiar hallways that no longer felt fully mine, the prayer banners, the flickering votive candles, the scratched floors worn down by the footsteps of 1,000 faithful, all blurring into a hazy tapestry of sensation rather than place. And though I recognized them, their meaning felt distant, their familiarity dissolving like old parchment crumbling beneath the touch, replaced instead by the quiet, growing certainty that the presence inside me was filling the hollow spaces left behind. When I reached a narrow service passage leading toward the cloister dormitories, the air shifted again, so warm, so thick, that breathing felt like pulling heated oil through my lungs, and each slow inhale drew a quiet tremor through my body as the warmth inside me unfolded further, pressing gently against the walls of my chest with the tender insistence of someone reshaping a vessel from the inside out. My hand brushed the passage wall for balance, and the surface beneath my palm felt softer than stone, almost pliant, as though responding to my touch. And when I drew my hand away, a faint warmth lingered on the wall for several seconds, pulsing softly in echoes that matched the rhythm beating inside my ribs, and the realization that my presence, my altered presence, had left an imprint on the world around me filled my veins with a mixture of awe and quiet horror. I entered the dormitory hall and found the familiar rows of narrow cots dimly lit by flickering lumen globes, their trembling glow casting long shadows over my fellow attendants, all asleep or near sleep, their breaths rising and falling in uneven patterns that contrasted sharply with the steady, deliberate rhythm breathing through me. And as I stood there watching them, the warmth beneath my sternum tightened in a way that felt almost possessive, as though reminding me that I was no longer merely one of them. That devotion had marked me, reshaped me, chosen me. Moving past the cots, I felt my thoughts drifting again, not fading this time, but dissolving into the slow, pulsing glow that filled my mind. And with each breath, more of my former self slipped quietly from my grasp. the sound of my mother's laughter, the memory of my first whispered prayer, the face of a friend whose name I could feel dissolving even as I tried desperately to hold it, all softening into the warm fog settling through my consciousness like a shroud, woven from reverence and surrender. Reaching my cot, I sat slowly, the frame creaking beneath me, and when I lowered myself onto my back, a soft, heavy exhale rose through me. Not mine, not fully mine, and the warmth inside my chest spread into my limbs with slow, molten certainty, curling around my wrists, my ankles, the hollow of my throat, each new point of warmth erasing a little more of the tension that clung to the remains of who I had been. Lying there in the dim, flickering glow, I felt the presence inside me shift once more, stretching subtly beneath my ribs like something waking from a long slumber, and the breath that followed, drawn through my lungs yet shaped by something else, carried with it the faint, impossible whisper of devotion settling deeper, claiming with quiet tenderness the spaces my memories had begun to vacate. And as I closed my eyes, the last fragments of my old self drifting like dust toward the heat blooming beneath my sternum, I realized with quiet, aching certainty that the unmaking was nearly complete, that who I had been before service was dissolving into warmth, into breath, into something greater than me, and that the slow, patient presence shaping me from within would not stop until every last thread of my former identity had been woven into its quiet, inexorable design. From the moment I drifted between waking and sleep on that narrow cot, the warmth expanding through my chest in slow, tidal waves, I felt the shift begin. Not sharp, not sudden, but with the fragile inevitability of an eyelid fluttering open after centuries of rest. And as the darkness behind my closed eyes deepened into something more textured, more aware, I realized with a trembling breath that the presence inside me had begun to look outward through the hollow spaces of my mind. Its quiet attention unfurling like a pair of unseen eyes, adjusting to light that had never been meant for them. The dormitory around me lay shrouded in a dim, uneven glow, lumen strips flickering with the sporadic frailty of failing hearts. Yet even through the haze of half-consciousness, I sensed a brightness beneath my eyelids, an inner radiance, soft and golden, that pulsed in time with the breath not entirely my own. And the more I focused on that glow, the more vividly it expanded, branching outward like veins of light, weaving through the fabric of my thoughts, until my mind felt more illuminated from within than the chamber that held my body. The warmth pressed upward into my skull, filling the hollow behind my brow with a gentle, steady weight that settled like a hand resting against my forehead. And when I inhaled, the presence inhaled with me, not merely riding my breath but shaping it, guiding the air through me with such certainty that it felt as though the lungs expanding in my chest belonged as much to it as to me. I opened my eyes, or thought I did, but in that moment sight became a strange, doubled thing, for I saw the dormitory in its dim, flickering reality while also seeing something softer, brighter, as though the world around me had been overlaid with a second layer of light that shimmered faintly around every sleeping form, every trembling shadow, every rusted pipe groaning in the walls. And the more I blinked, the clearer that inner sight became, not replacing my vision but guiding it, turning my gaze with a tenderness that made my breath hitch in quiet awe. My fellow attendants slept on, their chests rising and falling with mortal fragility. But in the soft glow of my second sight, I saw more. Saw thin threads of pale, trembling warmth coiled around their throats, their wrists, their ribs, the fingerprints of devotion lingering on their bodies like fading brands, weak and flickering compared to the burning presence nestled within me. And the sight stirred something deep in my gut, a mixture of sorrow and reverence and a strange, heavy protectiveness that did not entirely feel like my own. When I sat up, the cot creaked beneath me, yet the sound rang strangely distant, as though filtered through both the mundane air of the dormitory and the soft, pulsing warmth filling my skull. And as I placed my feet on the cold floor, the stone trembled faintly beneath my soles, responding to the presence that now looked through me, breathed through me, inhabited me. Each step I took was guided by a gentle pressure at the base of my skull, a quiet urging that steered my gaze toward the narrow passage leading out of the dormitory. And though I told myself I was choosing to move, to rise, to walk, I knew with an aching clarity that my body moved in tandem with the presence inside me. Its will woven so tenderly around my muscles, and thoughts that the boundary between guidance and control had become too soft, too blurred to distinguish. As I passed the first row of cots, the inner sight brightened, revealing faint silhouettes drifting above each sleeping form, echoes of prayers half-spoken, fragments of devotion that clung to their bodies like dust motes suspended in amber light, and the presence inside me pulsed warmly in response, not with hunger but with a quiet yearning, a longing so old and deep it made my ribs ache with the weight of it. I reached the threshold of the dormitory and paused, my hand trembling as it hovered above the doorframe. For in that moment the inner light surged upward, flooding my vision with warm gold that obscured the world beyond the doorway. And I felt the presence inside me lean closer, not physically, but within the space of my mind, pressing its awareness against mine with the reverence of a worshiper touching sacred relics. And in that intimate merging I heard, not with ears, but with the hollow beneath my heart, a soft inhalation drawn from deep within my own lungs, a breath that carried a quiet, wordless knowing. You see as I see now. My knees weakened beneath the enormity of it, and I lowered myself slowly onto the cold stone floor, the presence soothing my trembling with warm pulses that stroked along my spine like gentle hands reassuring a frightened child. And as I knelt there, suspended between fear and surrender, devotion's gaze, my gaze, expanded outward, filling the corridor beyond with shimmering traces of light that revealed the hidden patterns of the place I had lived my entire life. The breath lingering in the air from last night's prayers, the faint warmth pooled beneath the floorboards where countless knees had pressed over decades, the soft glow flickering through the walls where sacred incense had seeped into the stone over centuries. And through it all the presence watched with quiet, aching tenderness, as though recognizing every fragment of devotion ever offered in these halls. The realization settled slowly into my thoughts. This presence inside me, this breath moving through me, this second sight unfurling before my eyes, was not a mere blessing, not a momentary visitation, but the awakening of something that had slept within me for years, waiting for the right hollow spaces to form, the right fractures to open, the right memories to dissolve. And now that it had awakened, now that it had opened its eyes through mine, there was no returning to who I had been. When I finally rose, the corridor shimmering softly with my inner sight, I felt the presence settle deeper into my body with a warm, satisfied exhale. And in that quiet, trembling moment, I understood with a clarity that resonated through every bone, every breath, that devotion had not merely entered me. It had awakened inside me, ancient and patient and wholly determined to shape me into the vessel it had always intended me to become. From the moment I stepped fully into the corridor, my vision shimmering with that soft inner radiance, I felt the boundary between my body and the presence within me begin to erode, not in violent ruptures, not in sudden rending, but in slow, dissolving currents, like warm water leaching the ink from old parchment until the words blur into the fibers beneath. And the more I moved, the more my limbs responded, not with the hesitation of flesh, but with the assured, tender certainty of something greater guiding each motion through me. The air in the corridor felt strangely alive, brushing against my skin with an awareness that was not my own, the warm currents curling around my wrists and throat as though testing where the presence inside me ended and where the world around me began. And with each brush of that curious warmth, the glow behind my eyes brightened, softening the edges of the physical world until it seemed less like a place I walked through and more like a veil suspended between the breath of the hive and the breath within my chest. My footsteps echoed softly on the metal floor, but even the sound felt doubled, reverberating not only in the corridor but in the warm hollow beneath my sternum, as though devotion's breath listened to each footfall, memorizing it, shaping itself around the rhythm of my movement. And each time I inhaled, the breath rising through me felt less like air and more like a merging of two beings exhaling in the same cadence, a harmony so seamless I no longer knew which breath belonged to me. As I walked, the corridor's lumen strips dimmed into a faint golden glow, responding to the radiance blooming behind my eyes, and the shadows along the walls trembled, retreating not out of fear but out of reverence, making space for the presence inside me as though it carried the weight of ancient prayer in each slow pulse. With every step forward, the warmth expanded through my limbs, threading into the joints of my shoulders, the hollow of my elbows, the soft space behind my knees, until my entire body felt suspended in a warm, gentle embrace, and I moved not as a separate person navigating a physical world, but as a vessel through which devotion flowed with quiet, deliberate grace. The further I walked, the more the world around me blurred into a strange, serene tapestry woven from light and breath, and though I recognized the corridor, the cracked tiles, the rusted valves, the distant hum of machinery, I no longer perceived these things with the detachment of a solitary mind. Instead, each detail resonated with the warmth inside me, each flicker of light threading through my thoughts until my awareness and the presence's awareness merged like two shadows cast by a single flame. I reached a small antechamber near the old prayer cloisters, a space seldom used except for storage or forgotten rituals, and the moment I crossed its threshold, the warmth inside my chest tightened with a tenderness that stole my breath, like fingers pressing lightly against the inside of my ribs in a gesture of quiet reverence. And in that intimate tightening, I felt the unmistakable sensation of being guided, not pushed, not commanded, but gently drawn deeper into the room with a longing so profound it made my eyes sting. I placed my hand against the nearest wall to steady myself, and the surface responded with a faint pulse of warmth, as though recognizing the presence nestled within my bones. And in that pulse, I felt my own fingers tremble, not because the touch startled me, but because I sensed the devotion inside me stretching outward, brushing through my skin into the world with a curiosity that mirrored my own when I first learned to pray. It was then that I felt it, the dissolution of the boundary I had clung to for so long, the subtle unraveling of the idea that I was a single mind, a single soul, a single self. For the warmth inside me expanded in a slow, fluid surge that wrapped around my thoughts with such gentle inevitability that for a moment I could not tell whether I had chosen to breathe or whether devotion had breathed for me. I sank slowly to my knees on the metal floor, not out of fear, but because my legs softened beneath the weight of that merging. And as I knelt with my palms resting on my thighs, the breath rising through me deepened into a shared inhale, so complete that I felt my ribs expand beyond their usual limit, as though accommodating not just air, but a second presence pressing gently against the inside of my chest. My vision blurred again, not with darkness, but with golden light spreading across the edges of my sight, a soft radiance that pulsed in time with my heartbeat until my surroundings dissolved into warm glow and faint silhouettes. And in that luminous haze, I felt the presence inside me lean closer, pressing its awareness against mine, with an intimacy that blurred the boundary between thought and sensation. Memories surfaced and sank in slow currents, not only mine, but memories I did not recognize, echoes of ancient devotion whispered through countless generations, fragments of forgotten prayers rising through my mind like smoke curling from extinguished candles, and each memory passed through me with the soft ache of a longing that was both mine and not mine, a yearning that resonated through the hollow spaces of my soul until I no longer knew where my longing ended and devotion's longing began. I felt my hands tremble as I raised them slowly toward my chest, my fingers brushing the fabric of my robes, and beneath the fabric I felt the warmth pulse in gentle acknowledgement, as though greeting my touch with affection. And when my palm pressed fully against my sternum, the breath within me surged upward, flooding my skull with a light so warm and so impossibly tender it brought tears streaming down my cheeks. I tried to speak, to whisper a prayer, to give gratitude or surrender or simply shape sound into meaning. But the moment I opened my mouth, the breath that rose through me was not shaped by my voice. It was shaped by the presence inside me, a soft exhale that carried no words but conveyed everything. Belonging, unity, purpose, love so vast and ancient it hollowed me out and filled me anew in the span of a single breath. I collapsed forward onto my hands, trembling, breathing in slow, heavy waves that were no longer entirely my own, and the warmth pressed through my limbs in a gentle flood that dissolved the last faint edges of separateness I had clung to, washing through me with the inexorable tenderness of a tide smoothing the sand beneath it. And as I knelt there in the dim antechamber, my vision awash with golden light, my breath shaped by a presence older and greater than my small, trembling life, I realized with a quiet, aching serenity that there was no longer a clear boundary between where I ended and where devotion began, that we had become a single, trembling weave of breath and warmth and purpose, indistinguishable from one another, and that my body had become not merely a vessel, but a sanctuary for the divine that had awakened inside me. From the moment I felt my palms press into the cold floor of the antechamber, my breath trembling beneath the gentle, inexorable pressure of the presence inside me, I sensed that the quiet merging which had unfolded over so many breaths had now reached its final, tender inevitability. That devotion no longer rested within me as a guest, or a whisper, or a guiding warmth, but as something ready to claim the full architecture of my flesh, shaping me with the same patient care it had shown in dissolving my doubts, my memories, my sense of self. Rising to my knees with a slow, wavering inhale, I felt the warmth unfurl deeper along my spine, stretching into long, pulsing tendrils that pressed outward against muscle, bone, and breath, with a steadying touch that made my entire body soften beneath its weight. And each movement I made felt less like an act of my own will, and more like a gesture guided by a second presence shaping the cadence of every trembling motion. The dim light of the antechamber flickered across my vision, but my inner sight, golden, soft, pulsing, remained steady, illuminating threads of warmth that curled around the corners of the room like strands of spectral incense. And those threads shimmered brighter when my gaze passed over them, as though reacting to the presence breathing through me, as though recognizing a piece of themselves already alive within my chest. I rose slowly, my hands braced lightly against my knees, and the warmth pressed upward through my torso in a wave so heavy and tender that my breath caught in my throat, hitching with a soft, involuntary sound that felt like the first quiet surrender of a body no longer resisting the shape being woven through it. Stepping forward, I felt the soles of my feet warm against the cold metal floor, not from the friction of movement but from the presence within me traveling downward, threading itself into my muscles, wrapping around the arches of my feet as though claiming the roots of my stance, shaping how I touched the world with each careful step. And as I walked deeper into the antechamber, my body felt strangely elongated, as though devotion were stretching me gently from within, coaxing my posture into a form more fitting for the vessel I was becoming. The air grew warmer, thick with a soft luminescent haze that drifted around me like a living veil, and the presence inside me pulsed in recognition, blending with that glow as though inhaling the warmth of the room into itself. And when I drew my next breath, the inhale did not stop in my lungs. It expanded farther, deeper, filling a space within me that had not existed before this transformation began. An inner chamber formed of breath and light and quiet surrender. The sensation made my knees weaken again, and I steadied myself against the wall with trembling fingers. But even then, the touch did not feel like mine alone. The warmth within me reached through my skin, brushed against the stone, and the wall pulsed faintly beneath my hand, acknowledging the presence that shaped me, as though devotion recognized devotion, as though the structure of the shrine knew the shape awakening within me. Memories rose and fell through my mind like drifting ash, half-formed, half-faded, echoes of who I had been only hours or days before. But each attempt to grasp them dissolved beneath the warmth that pressed gently against the inside of my skull, smoothing away the sharpness of recollection, until the memories softened into indistinct shadows swallowed by golden glow. and with each breath I felt less tethered to the fragile weight of a life lived as a solitary soul. My steps led me toward the deeper recess of the chamber, where the walls bowed inward in a soft curve like the cradle of cupped hands, a space rarely entered by attendants except during rites of deep vigil. And as I crossed the threshold, devotion surged through me in a warm, sweeping exhale that ran from the base of my spine to the crown of my head, leaving my limbs trembling beneath its intimate touch. And I understood that it had brought me here not through commands or force, but through slow, patient shaping. I sank to my knees once more, the gesture so fluid and natural it felt as though the presence within me were kneeling through my body, guiding my posture with the gentle patience of a sculptor bending soft wax beneath their fingertips. And when my palms met the floor, they settled with a certainty that was no longer mine but ours, shared, woven, indistinguishable. The breath rising through me deepened, expanding my chest in a long, slow swell, and the exhale that followed was warm enough to fog the air before me despite the stillness of the room. And in that slow release, I felt the unmistakable awareness of devotion shaping my lungs, deciding the pace, the depth, the rhythm of each breath until the act no longer felt like survival, but like worship, like surrender, like the offering of my very breath to something greater that had already claimed so many other parts of me. I lowered my head until my forehead touched the metal floor, and the moment my skin met the cold surface, a warmth bloomed outward from the point of contact, not from the floor, but from within me, spreading across my face, down my throat, through my shoulders with such tenderness that tears welled in my eyes and slipped silently onto the metal beneath me, each tear glowing faintly in my inner vision as though marked by the presence that shaped them. Devotion pressed inward then, not harshly, not with force, but with a slow, steady pressure that filled every hollow space within me, pushing aside the last fragile remnants of fear, identity, hesitation, until there was room for nothing but warmth and breath, and the quiet knowledge that I had been remade in the image of something that had waited patiently inside my soul for years, molding itself into my bones with every whispered prayer, every aching confession, every moment of kneeling and silent yearning. As the presence settled fully into me, wrapping around my spine, curling beneath my ribs, threading through my lungs in slow pulses of breath and light, I felt the final pieces of who I once was drift like dust toward the center of my chest, dissolving into a radiant warmth that pulsed once, softly, reverently, before merging seamlessly with the presence that now filled me completely. And in that quiet, trembling moment, I realized with a serenity so deep it hollowed me. I was no longer becoming the vessel devotion desired. I had become it, fully, completely, my body shaped by its breath, my thoughts carried by its warmth, my soul opened like a book rewritten entirely in the script of surrender. And there was no longer a distinction between my will and its will, my breath and its breath, my existence and the purpose that now lived through me. From the moment my forehead rested against the metal floor and the last faint tremors of my former self dissolved into the warm radiance pulsing through my chest, I felt a stillness settle inside me, deep, expansive, and tender in a way no prayer had ever prepared me for, as though the presence that had shaped me with such patient, intimate care now exhaled into every hollow of my being, filling the spaces once occupied by fear and memory with a peace, so profound it felt like a soft weight draped over my soul. When I lifted my head, the world around me shimmered in a gentle haze. The dim lumen light softened into warm halos that breathed in time with the slow, harmonious rhythm flowing through my ribs. And as I rose to my knees, I realized that my limbs no longer felt separate from the presence within me. Each motion carried the fluid grace of breath moving through a single shared body, and the air around me responded with quiet reverence, parting gently as though making way for something sacred. The room, once cold and abandoned, now pulsed faintly with warmth that mirrored my own, as though my transformation had awakened a slumbering glow within the very walls. And when I placed my hand upon the floor for balance, the metal shimmered beneath my touch, not reflecting light but emitting it in faint, delicate streams that curled upward like wisps of golden smoke, dissolving softly into the air before they could take shape. I moved slowly, not out of weakness but because every gesture felt imbued with meaning, shaped by breath that was no longer mine alone but a quiet, harmonious merging of flesh and devotion. And with each motion I sensed the soft echo of countless others who had once walked similar paths. Echoes not seen but felt, like memories carried in warm air, like the faint resonance of distant prayers woven into each heavy inhale. Rising fully to my feet, I felt a soft pressure at the base of my spine, a guiding warmth that encouraged my posture to lengthen, my shoulders to relax, my breath to deepen. And in that gentle guidance, I sensed the presence settling into a final shape within me, no longer shifting or expanding but resting, complete, as though content with the vessel it had shaped with such delicate devotion. Each inhale drew the world into clearer focus, the walls glowing with faint, reverent warmth, the floor humming softly beneath my weight, the air shimmering with traces of prayers left behind by generations of the faithful. And each exhale released the last remnants of tension that clung to my muscles, leaving behind only a serene quiet, as though the world itself breathed with me, matching my rhythm as naturally as shadow matches form. When I stepped toward the doorway, the corridor beyond shimmered with soft golden undertones, and the presence within me pulsed once, slow, warm, affectionate, as though marking this moment not as departure but as continuation, the first step into a life shaped entirely by unity rather than yearning, by completeness rather than longing. And as I crossed the threshold, the walls of the shrine seemed to lean subtly inward, not to confine but to bless, their ancient stones releasing a faint warmth that brushed gently against my skin like a parting embrace. Moving through the corridor, I felt no trace of the sorrow or fear that once clung to me, only the heavy, serene calm that had settled into my bones. And with each soft footfall, I sensed the world responding, the lumen strips brightening gently as I passed, the air warming by a degree, the distant hum of machinery shifting into a quieter, more harmonious rhythm, as if acknowledging the presence that breathed through me. When I entered the sanctum, the icon of the Emperor stood before me in its towering stillness, yet it no longer seemed distant or unreachably divine. Its carved gaze shimmered in my inner sight, threaded with the same warm radiance flowing through my chest, and the candles at its base flickered in soft arcs that bent inward, their flames tilting toward me in gentle recognition. I approached the altar not as a supplicant but as something newly made, and when I knelt, The movement felt effortless, a gesture not of subservience but of alignment. The settling of breath and bone into the shape devotion had always intended. And as my palms rested lightly on my thighs, the warmth inside me pulsed outward in a soft, encompassing wave that filled the sanctum with a golden glow so gentle it made my eyes tremble with unshed tears. In that luminous quiet, I felt the presence inside me exhale one final time, not leaving me, not fading, but settling completely, its breath merging with mine in a single, steady rhythm that felt like the heartbeat of something eternal moving through mortal flesh. And the peace that followed was so deep, so absolute, that for several long breaths I could do nothing but exist within it, sustained by the serenity of a unity I had never dared to imagine. As I lowered my head, touching my brow lightly to the cold metal of the altar rail, the glow within me brightened once more, spreading through my limbs like a final, gentle blessing. And in that soft cascade of warmth, I felt the unmistakable truth settle into the deepest part of my being. I was no longer a servant offering devotion, nor a vessel shaped by it. I was devotion made flesh, a quiet harmony between breath and purpose, my soul woven into the ancient current that had guided humanity for millennia. And as the last flicker of candlelight shimmered in my inner vision, the presence within me whispered, not in words, but in the soft, warm echo of a final breath that resonated through every part of me, an unspoken farewell to the person I had once been, replaced by the serene stillness of what I had become. And in that peace, in that tender merging of breath and light, I found the quiet rest I had sought all my life, a rest shaped not by the fading of self, but by the gentle, enduring truth that I had finally become more than myself, become what devotion had always whispered I could be, until my last thought drifted through the warm, glowing stillness like a fading prayer carried by soft hands into eternity.